Now, how many people saw the film Noah? How many people have seen the film Noah? Okay, well, we're not going to talk about that tonight, because I haven't seen it. I don't intend to see it, because I've read the book. And my experience has been, when you go and see a movie that's made from the book, the movie isn't nearly as good as the book. And I think from what I've read about Noah, that's probably the case. So I'm not going to talk about Noah tonight, the movie. I'm going to talk about the real Noah and the flood that happened at his time. How many people are familiar with Creation Ministries International? How many people know anything about it at all? Okay, good. Excellent. Then you'll know, those of you who put up your hand, that the ministry is all about equipping Christians with information so that when they get questions from other people, whether they're Christians or non-Christians, about the scientific validity of what's in the Bible. Now, I just should point out, the Bible isn't a science textbook, right? And I have a colleague who says it's a good thing, too, because if it was, it'd have to get revised about every 10 years. Right, because science is continually changing. But the Bible is more like a history book, particularly the Genesis part of it. But the account of history that's in there actually touches on various disciplines in science, like biology and geology. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, how the biblical account of history in Genesis interacts with the science of geology. And so CMI is about getting information about that into the hands of Christians so that when they get questions from either other Christians or non-Christians about how does that historical account of the Bible marry up with the scientific observations, they're able to answer those questions so that they can be prepared, as we are instructed in the Bible, to be able to give a reason for the hope that we have when anyone happens to ask us, or in a more active role that we can engage in demolishing arguments that set themselves up against the Word of God. And we have a number of mechanisms for doing that. One is a website. This gives you access to over 8,000 articles that have been written by various PhD scientists on this particular topic of creation versus evolution in the general sense. But of course, to get there, you need to know the web address, right? And it's pretty complicated. Anybody gone to the website recently? Okay, some people already know it. So if you spotted those hands and you can't remember this web address, you can go and ask the pastor. It's this. Okay, so, and if you can't remember that, you can Google creation and it'll probably come up as one of the first on the list. Now, if you get a question to which you don't know the answer, you can go to the website and click on this Topics tab, and you'll get a screen like that. And if you click on this one down here, you'll get a screen like that where there's a whole list of the topics in alphabetical order that have articles related to them. So you can click on the topic that most matches the question that you got, figure out an answer, and go back to the person and say, how about this? For example, here's one away down here on the flood, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. And it looks like this. So you can see there's another linked list. If you click on those, you'll get the actual articles that are written with those titles. And for those of you who want to know something about the Noah movie, they wrote a review of it that was published on the website, and you can find that at creation.com/Noah-movie. Another mechanism for getting information into your hands, a little bit more painlessly perhaps than having to go and search through a website, is a thing called the InfoBytes newsletter. How many people get InfoBytes newsletter? A few. Okay, well, we're going to give the rest of you a chance to start getting these newsletters. Looks like this. Comes out, kind of whenever, every now and again. And it has a list of some of the articles that have appeared recently that might be of interest. Gives you a little teaser about what it is, and then a link that you can go directly to that article and read it. So I'm going to ask those volunteers who are going to pass around the clipboards if they would do so now. So we're going to pass around this clipboard, and if you can just put down your name and your email address and your postal code, then when I get these back to the office, they'll start sending you this email. And if you can keep circulating these, that would be appreciated, because we're going to need them back. Okay, the global flood. Did it really happen? Well, that prompts a bunch of ancillary questions, such as, was it real? That's what I said. Was it really global? You often hear, particularly in Christian circles, that some Christians take the view that the flood wasn't global. It was simply constrained to the Mesopotamian Valley. Was there enough water for a global flood? Where did it come from? Where did it go? How did all the animals fit in the ark? How did the animals get to the ark? How did the animals get from the ark to Australia when they got off the ark? Anybody ever thought about these questions? Has this ever, yeah? How did Noah and his family and all the animals breathe when they were way up above the mountains? People go climbing Mount Everest. They got to sometimes take oxygen with them because it's hard to breathe away up there. Could Noah's family, remember there were only Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives, so that's like 8 people in total, maybe only 6. Could they repopulate the earth? Could only 6 people result in all the billions of people we have on the earth today? How did the freshwater fish survive in the salt water? And what about this idea that the biblical flood story might actually be copied from some other flood stories in from other peoples? So I'm going to try and answer all of these questions tonight with evidence, okay? But before I do that, there's some things we need to discuss about science. You've probably all heard the expression, let's let the data speak for itself. Well, actually it should be, let's let the data speak for themselves, okay? But it's interesting thing about data is they don't do that. They don't speak for themselves. To illustrate that, here are some data. Are they speaking to anyone? Okay? No, the thing about data is it needs to be interpreted. The numbers don't mean anything all on their own. You need a framework for interpretation. And here is the framework for interpreting these data. It's actually part of a 3-country survey on people's beliefs about origins. The 3 countries were the US, the UK, and Canada, and these are the Canadian results. Now, I'm not going to talk about these. This was only to illustrate this point about data not speaking for themselves. But when you know what the interpretive framework is, then you can actually tease out some interesting bits of information. For example, these 2 numbers tell us that Canadian women are wiser than Canadian men. And these 3 numbers tell us that older Canadians are wiser than younger Canadians. So if you put those 2 things together, the logical conclusion is that the wisest Canadians are the older women. And I didn't need a 3-country survey to tell me that, because my wife is a bit older than I am. All right, data don't speak for themselves. They need to be interpreted. And to do that, you need an interpretive framework. And the nature of this framework is heavily dependent on presuppositions, things that aren't proven to be true, but are just assumed to be true. And a good example of this is a courtroom. In a courtroom, we have one set of data. They call it the evidence. But there are 2 interpretations based on 2 different presuppositions. There's one interpretation based on the presupposition that the defendant is innocent, and another interpretation based on the presupposition that the defendant is guilty. And what the jury is supposed to do is look at the evidence, listen to the interpretations, decide which interpretation best explains the evidence, and therefore which presupposition is most likely correct. And I submit that kind of works pretty well in this whole question of creation or evolution. If you look at the evidence, we have 2 interpretations of that evidence. We all have the same evidence. You just have 2 interpretations based on 2 different presuppositions. So what are those presuppositions? Well, from the secular side, the fundamental presupposition is that man gets to define what's true. Okay? And particularly in science, what man has defined to be true is this idea of naturalism, that nature is all that there is, or materialism, that material is all that there is, that there's no supernatural. And then arising out of that is the idea that the laws of physics and chemistry are universal, that is, they apply everywhere all the time, except when that's inconvenient, as in the Big Bang, but that's another presentation. And that's one of the outcomes of this set of presuppositions, is the idea that the Big Bang is the way the universe originated and evolved. Abiogenesis is the way that life originated, and then Darwinism is the way that life on Earth evolved. So those are kind of outgrowths of these basic presuppositions. From the biblical perspective, the fundamental presupposition is that God defines what's true. And of course, that means that the Word of God, which is the Bible, would be true. And that would mean that the creation account in the Bible is true. That is, that everything was made in 6 24-hour days. Life things were created after their own kind, and all that happened about 6,000 years ago. And there was a global flood which considerably reshaped the planet about 4,500 years ago. Now, we would also, because God is a God of constancy, the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, he's not a capricious God like the Roman gods, we can also assume that the laws of physics and chemistry are universal. That is, they apply everywhere all the time, except when God may augment those laws with a particular intervention. And we would call those miracles. Okay? Now, we need to also understand a little bit about science, I think, because it's important when we start interpreting things to understand what science really is, the way it's currently practiced. If you look in Wikipedia, and this isn't meant as an endorsement of Wikipedia as a source of totally unbiased information, but it's a place that a lot of people go to look for stuff. So this is what they say in Wikipedia about science, or at least they did when I accessed it a little while ago. Science, that's one of the problems with Wikipedia. It can change from time to time. Science is an enterprise that builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions about the universe. All right, so testable explanations and predictions. From a more legal perspective, which might be a little bit more rigorous than Wikipedia, this is what was written in a judgment in a case in the U.S. where a group of people brought a case against the Dover Area School District to prevent intelligent design being taught in the science classroom. And indeed, they were successful in that, in having it excluded. And this is what the judge wrote in his decision. This self-imposed convention, that is, this naturalism idea that is part of science, which has been self-imposed, which limits inquiry, so it is actually constraining the inquiry that scientists are allowed to make, to testable natural explanations about the natural world is referred to by philosophers as methodological naturalism. That's that naturalism stuff I mentioned earlier. Sometimes known as the scientific method. Methodological naturalism is a ground rule of science, okay? So if you want to play in science, it happens to be a rule. It's kind of like the two-line offside pass, right? That used to be, a ground rule of hockey. You want to play hockey, you play by that rule. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean the rule is correct, because they changed that rule. And now the ground rule of hockey is a little bit different. But in this case, naturalism is a ground rule of science today, and that requires scientists to seek explanations in the world around us based on what we can observe, test, replicate, and verify. Okay? If you can't do those things, it doesn't qualify as science. And that's why they said, okay, discussing creation isn't science, because you can't observe, test, replicate, and verify it. But I submit if you really look at evolution, you can't do it for evolution either. So that gets us into this difference that was mentioned earlier between operational science, which is the kind of science where you can verify things by repeated experimentation. And it's the kind of stuff that gives us all our technological whiz-bang things and all of our medical advances. So it's all about what we can, as the judge said, observe, test, replicate, and verify. So-called historical science, on the other hand, because it's something that happened in the past, like that thing that got fossilized, it's an event that happened in the past, it's not verifiable by repeated experimentation. You cannot test, replicate, and verify it. It's really constructing a story, which is history, about the past that tries to explain how what we can currently see came into existence. So you've really got to question whether or not that kind of stuff actually qualifies as science, because you can't test, replicate, verify it. I like to use the 747 as a kind of an example that pulls this together. Operational science tells us how it flies, right? But knowing how the 747 flies doesn't actually tell you anything about how the 747 came to be, right? So to put that in an evolutionary context, knowing how the cells in our body operate, you know, how they function, all the stuff that goes on inside them, doesn't tell you anything about how they came to be. So if you look at the 747 through an interpretive framework that doesn't impose this constraint, this limiting that limits inquiry by limiting it only to naturalism, if you look at it with your mind a little bit more open than that, it's pretty obvious that the 747 happened by design. In fact, even the arch evolutionist and atheist Richard Dawkins said, biology is the study of things that look like they were designed for a purpose. But then he goes on to explain why that's not the case. If you look at the 747, though, through a filter that says intelligent agents are not allowed to be involved in the creation of or in the origin of the 747, then you're forced to conclude that it happened by accident because you have no alternative. Doesn't mean it's right. It simply means that your ground rule has constrained your solution space. It's constrained the things that you can use to explain how that came about to require that you make that kind of result. So it really does depend. What your answer is really does depend on your presuppositions. And as I say, I think it's the same thing with this creation evolution. If you look at the evidence, and we all have the same evidence, it's what we can see in nature and what we can measure it and what we can test and replicate with respect to it. If you look at it, it looks like it's been created. Like I said, Richard Dawkins even admits that. But if you look at it with the idea that you can't have any intelligent agents allowed, which is the intelligent design movement, or if you like, everything has to be explained within the constraints of naturalism or materialism, then you wind up being forced into something like evolution as the explanation. Not because it's right, but because your ground rule has limited the scope of your explanation. This guy puts it pretty nicely, I think. He's an evolutionary geneticist, so guess where he believes. And he says, we take the side of science, and by that he means naturalism, in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated, just-so stories. Why? Because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. We have a presupposition, right? But he's not done yet. He says, it's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but, on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. If I may be allowed to paraphrase him a little bit, what he said is, science has built this box called naturalism, and scientists are not allowed to think outside the box. They have to make up all of their explanations to fit inside the box, no matter how silly they are. And it doesn't make them right. It just makes them fit in the box. And then he says, moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot let a divine foot in the door. So the reason they've made this presupposition has nothing to do with science and everything to do with philosophy. And it's a mechanism for them to be able to dismiss the potential existence of a supernatural creator God, because it's got very nasty personal implications for them. Okay, with that background now, let's go on and look at the flood. What does the Bible say about the flood? Remember, our starting presupposition is that the Bible is the Word of God and it's true. Well, among other things, it says there was a 120-year warning. Oh, I apologize for the tiny print. Now I can say almost anything. And God says to Noah, make yourself an ark. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life. And of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort, or kind, some translations say kind, into the ark, to keep them alive. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of animals that are not clean, 2, a male and his mate, and 7 pairs of birds. Now, clean animals are in fact cud-chewing quadrupeds with cloven hooves. Okay, so that's like ox and sheep and goats and harts and gazelles and roebucks and all of those kinds of things. So that's what had to go on the ark, right? Then it says that in the 600th year of Noah's life, man, imagine living 600 years. Eh? Whoa. In the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. And then it goes on and describes a whole bunch more stuff. And then it says, in the 601st year, that's like a year later, in the first month, on the first of the month, the waters were dried from off the earth. And in the second month, on the 27th day, the earth had dried out. Okay, so that's kind of, it says a whole bunch of other stuff about the flood, but that's the part that I picked out because I want to talk specifically about those. So, to address the first question then, was the flood really global? Well, what does the Bible say? It says the flood is going to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. So that would sound like it means all of the flesh everywhere on the earth. That's everything that is on the earth shall die. Every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground. All the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed upon the mountains, covering them to 15 cubits. Now, a cubit is about like that, so the top of the mountain plus 15 more of these. And then it says, all flesh died that moved on the earth. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. Now, that sounds to me like it's got to be pretty global, because if it isn't, some of the life is going to survive. And in particular, if you look at this, right, the waters are 15 cubits above the top of the highest mountains. If the flood was only local and not global, you'd have something like this. Now, clearly that's not beyond God's capability to do that, because he parted the waters of the Red Sea, right, and let the Israelites walk across. So he could do that, but it doesn't correspond to all the rest of the stuff, right? So the waters would go up over the top of the mountains and run down the other side to cover the rest of the earth. Okay, so according to the Bible, it was really global. So do we have any evidence of a global flood? After all, we ought to make our decisions based on evidence. Well, what about this? Sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock gets laid down in water. So this area here, the Grand Canyon, where there's layers and layers and layers of sedimentary rock, was one time all underwater. And in fact, 75% of the Earth's surface is covered by sedimentary rock. And if you look at it, say, for North America, it looks like this. It's pretty much everywhere except the Canadian Shield, which is igneous rock, right? And that would make sense if it was laid down initially, covered up by a global flood, and then scraped off by an ice age that immediately followed it on the Canadian Shield. Okay, but all the rest of it is sedimentary rock. So that bit of evidence is just what you would expect from a global flood. Now, if you look at mountains, that's another piece of evidence. And if you look at the mountains, those are all actually mountains in the Rocky Mountains, you'll find that they're all composed of sedimentary rock as well. They've been pushed up and folded and things on. And if you go up there and pick up the rocks, you'll find they're full of marine fossils. And these little marine animals don't go mountain climbing, so when that rock was laid down, it must have been underwater. Now, how did it get to where it is now? We'll talk about that a little bit later. The other thing you find out is you got all of these marine fossils all over the place where they're way, way far away from current oceans, like Cyprus and Israel and Ohio. You know, these are, you got these obvious marine fossils all over the place. And once again, that's all consistent with a global flood. How about the fossil record? You know, this is a representation of the fossil record that shows kind of typically which kinds of fossils are found in which rock layer. Now, on this particular diagram, each of the rock layers has a duration associated with it in millions of years. And that comes from uniformitarian geology. But if you ignore that for a moment, and then the evolutionists say that this time sequence indicates increasing complexity in life. So we have a succession of life. But if you ignore the time for a moment and just look at the rock layers as sedimentary rock layers that got laid down, this evidence is also consistent with that being a sequence of burial as the floodwaters increased. What you get first are all the bottom-dwelling sea creatures that are just there, and they get covered up, and then gradually increasing complexity in life, because the more complex life can actually run away from the encroaching water until finally there's no place to run, right? And they wind up getting buried in graveyards. So once again, the observations are consistent with a global flood. It's what you would expect. Now, another piece of evidence are these things called polystrate fossils, in particular tree trunks, where we have tree trunks going across, that have been fossilized, that are going across many, many layers in the geological column, which according to standard geology correspond to millions of years. But trees wouldn't last for millions of years, right? They'd rot. So this is clear evidence that this was buried rapidly, right? With those layers of rock, sediment, coming in very quickly, covering up the trees and preserving them so that they turned into fossils. And that, once again, just what you would expect from a global flood, not from this kind of long, slow process that is generally talked about in terms of how these rock layers got laid down. Oops, I kind of messed this up. Ignore that for a minute until we get the rest of the material up on the slides. Another indication that supports the global flood, or another piece of evidence, I should say, is what's called folded strata. And these occur all over the place, where you can see the layers of rock that have been very severely folded. The top one, not so much, but over here on the bottom right, it's really been folded around. And if you look at it, the crystals, the rock crystals, stay the same through all of those folds. There's no indication that they've cracked or that they've been melted and recrystallized or anything. They're all just the same as the ones that are out here. Now that, again, indicates that happened when the rocks were soft, when they were like plasticine, if you like, rather than when they were hard. The usual explanation is that those things happen very slowly and gradually under significant temperature and pressure. But if that were to happen, you would get this recrystallization where you have the bending, and that's not obvious. So once again, the evidence is consistent with the global flood. So let's go back to the Grand Canyon there, because there's some more stuff that's pretty interesting. If you look at this surface up at the top, it's nice and flat, right across on both sides of the canyon, and it extends for a very large area, this flat surface. It's called a planation surface. Now, if you think about all of these rocks from a biblical perspective, way down at the bottom of the canyon, you have some igneous rocks, which were very likely, they're made out of the magma from the molten mantle, so they're very likely rocks that were created as part of Creation Week. But then all of these other sedimentary rocks were likely laid down during what's referred to as the inundatory phase of the flood. That is when the waters were rising. They were, with all of the motion that was going on, it wasn't a nice gentle rise. There was lots of sloshing about because of all the tectonic activity we'll talk about later. So it was eroding rocks from elsewhere and laying down the sediment that we now see in the Grand Canyon. Then it reaches the zenith, and it starts to recede back into the oceans, right, as a result of these big trenches that have been formed and all of that. That's what does the planing, right? You got big sheets of water that's running off that planes things off. And if you look at mesas and things like that, there's a place in the U.S. Where you've got all of these mesas that are around. They've all got nice planation surfaces on the top, and then all around them has been eroded away. So as the water is running off in sheets, it's doing this planing, just like a plane, wood to wood. In the recessive stage, the water is receding right at the top, and then as it gets lower and lower, it starts to actually eat into the weak places in the rock and carve the canyons. So the canyons are formed by what they call the dispersive recession. Another interesting piece of evidence is what's referred to as paraconformities, and probably the most well-known one is between the Coconino Sandstone and the Hermit Shale in the Grand Canyon. And you can see it's a nice straight line there. Now, in the standard geological interpretation, there's a layer of rock missing between those two that appears in other places, and that layer of rock that's missing corresponds to a time interval, supposedly, of 6 million years. Now, you would think if that top of the Hermit Shell was exposed, which it must have been if it didn't get any more rock deposited on it, if it were exposed for 6 million years, you'd see all kinds of erosion evidence. Look at the Grand Canyon, the amount of erosion evidence you can see already there. But there is no erosion evidence there at all. And from a biblical perspective, there's actually no time missing, right? Because those layers were all both laid down during the flood. Now, so we're seeing evidence in the geological observations that are consistent, well explained by a global flood. So that gets us to our next question. Is there actually enough water on the earth to cause a global flood? Now this is interesting because scientists are now saying, you probably read it in the paper, that there was a global flood on Mars. Right? How much water is there on Mars? None. But they seem perfectly prepared to say there was a global flood on Mars by looking at all of the evidence that they can see that looks like flood evidence. But here on Earth, we look at all the evidence that looks like flood evidence, and they say, well, there couldn't have been a global flood. But we've got lots of water. If you're Chris Hadfield, you'd get to look at the Earth from here, and it looks like it's all water. In fact, 70% of the Earth's surface is covered with water, and a lot of it is in really deep trenches, right alongside the continents where you get the continental drift going on. So if you were to push those up, so you push all the water out, and you push all the mountains down to make the Earth more or less smooth, there's enough water to actually form a layer 2.7 kilometers deep. Now, it said when I read the stuff from the Bible before that the water covered all the high mountains. So how high are mountains? Well, I went to school in Hamilton, and I lived at the foot of this mountain. And they call it a mountain. Some people are pretty desperate for mountains. But Google Earth tells me the top of it is only 220 meters above sea level. So with 2.7 kilometers of water, it'd all be underwater. And some people think that would probably be a good thing for Hamilton to be underwater. I don't know. So I found another Hamilton mountain in Washington State. And I guess because it's an American mountain, it's taller than our Hamilton mountain, but it's still only 700. I mean, it looks like a pretty impressive mountain, but it's still only 700 meters above sea level. Now, I lived in just outside Calgary for a number of years, and so we used to go up into the Rockies, which are really impressive mountains, and to places like Banff and Lake Louise and all of that. So I looked them up on Google Earth, and they'd all be underwater, even at their present altitude. With 2.7 kilometers of water, they'd all be underwater. Not very good for Alberta tourism, but what can you do? Now, of course, Mount Everest at 8.85 kilometers is a bit higher than 2.7. But if you were to go up on Mount Everest, not recommended incidentally, not these days, it's kind of dangerous, you would find, if you look at it in the picture, you can see that it's made out of sedimentary rock. And in fact, if you were to go up there and pick up that rock, you'd need to leave it there, you'd find it's full of marine fossils. And once again, the marine fossils don't go mountain climbing, so when that rock was laid down, it was underwater. Now, not necessarily at 8.85 kilometers, almost certainly not at 8.85 kilometers, because it's been pushed up, and we'll talk more about that later. Okay, so where did the water come from? If we got all of this water, where did it come from? Well, what it says, as I read before, is in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month of the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were opened. Now, some translations say the floodgates of the sky were opened. Okay, so we got water coming from two places, the floodgates of the great deep and the windows of heaven. I think probably the windows of heaven we can understand. I'll talk a little bit more about it. But how about these fountains of the great deep? Well, consider this. We know about tectonic plates, right, or continental drift, that the continents are on these big slabs of rock that are moving slowly across the Earth's surface. That's referred to now as often as plate tectonics. The movement today is quite slow. It ranges from, the slowest one is in the order of 10 to 40 millimeters per year, right? Which is about the same rate as which your fingernails grow, apparently. And the other is, the fastest one is about 160 millimeters per year, which is about how fast your hair grows. And these things cause a lot of earthquake activity, seismic activity, right? So you get earthquakes occurring where these plates rub together. You get volcanoes occurring where the plates rub together. So you get a lot of seismic activity going on. Because here's what's happening, right? Where the two rub together, come together, push together, one of them slides underneath the other one and goes down in a trench. And then over in the other part, you've got the crust pulling apart, and it's what's called rifting, and the magma is pushing up underneath it. That's what's going on in the mid-Atlantic ridge, that's spreading apart, and the magma's coming up underneath. And over here, it's pushing down in subducting. And here's what's happening then. You've got rifting, you've got the magma coming up to the surface, causing volcanic eruptions underneath the seafloor. Over at the edge of the continent, you've got the plates rubbing together, and that pushing causes stress that pushes the rocks up, right? That's kind of the general process about how the mountains are formed. Now, we have a different time consideration between what standard geologists say and what the Bible says, and I'll get to that in a minute. So, for the fountains of the Great Deep erupting, there are actually two possibilities for the source of that water. One is that the magma from this rifting is coming up in big things and contacting the water in the oceans and basically vaporizing it. So it shoots up into the sky and then comes down as rain. The other possibility is that rocks actually themselves contain a lot of water. And so the water, like in aquifers and things, that the rocks could be rupturing and that water being ejected under pressure, like an artesian well. Right? So there's two possibilities for the fountains of the Great Deep. Now, the scientists have sort of projected the motions of all of these tectonic plates back in time. Now, remember, that's kind of not really science because you can't test it, can't do experiments to test it, but they projected backwards, and based on those projections and the shape of the continents, they come up with this idea that at one point in time, they were all together. Right? And that's actually consistent with what the Bible says about how the earth was formed. Right? Because in one place it says, and God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together. And remember, he started out with water, and he separated the waters above from the waters below. And so the waters below were the waters under the heavens. Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear. So if the waters were all gathered together in one place, the land must have been together in another one place. Right? So that the idea of this supercontinent, which is generally called Pangaea, is again consistent with the account of creation that's in the Bible. Now, what the secular scientists suppose is that this Pangaea spreads apart very slowly, basically at the present rate, over millions of years. So you have some millions of years, you get to this point, and then after another 50 million years, you get to this point, and then after another 85 million years, you get to this point, and then after another 65 million years, you get to this point. So that's the kind of the secular interpretation based on uniformitarian principles about how we got from Pangaea to where we are now. But if you go back here and look at what's going on here, a fellow by the name of John Baumgartner, who worked at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, developed a very sophisticated finite element model for this flow of rocks and plates in the crust and the mantle. And he found, given experimentally observed, experimentally measured characteristics of rock, that this could get into this subduction could get into a runaway condition, that it could start happening very quickly because of the nature, the plasticity, and that of the rocks. And so you get this plate plunging rapidly down into the mantle, and what it's doing then is pulling the plate that's up on the surface after it, because they're kind of connected, right? I mean, they're all part of a single piece. So it's pulling that along behind it, and it drops down into the crust, into the mantle very quickly. And he referred to that as runaway subduction, which creates a very large force here at the intersection, because the one is moving very quickly relative to the other. So there's a huge force pushing on that continental plate, and that's what's pushing the mountains up. Only it's happening much more quickly than the secular scientist's assumption about all happening at today's rate. Yes, so he referred to that as catastrophic plate tectonics, and you can see from his computer simulation the sort of thing that's happened. After 10 days, those plates have penetrated a little bit into the surface. After 30 days, they're a little bit further. After 50 days, where are you? Hello there. After 50 days, you've got some plates that have gone all the way from the surface all the way down to the bottom of the mantle. And then after 70 days, that's only like a couple of months, they've actually turned over and started to go along the surface of the core. What that looks like from the surface of the Earth is that these continents are spreading apart very, very quickly. In fact, his computer simulation determined that they would spread at the rate of 3.5 kilometers per hour instead of millimeters per year. Right? So there is a huge amount of tectonic activity going on during this flood period. So if you go back and look at this, then we have now 3.5 kilometers per hour instead of 100 millimeters per year. And if you look at how deep the mantle is, only 700 kilometers, that means that this rock under these conditions would go from the top of the Earth, from the crust, all the way down to the interface with the outer core in about 200 hours. Now, that's not... What's coming up next? That's not... Oh yeah, so that's not enough time for the rock to actually heat up and melt. So if this actually happened, what you should see are some slabs of cold, dense rock that are very deep in the Earth. In fact, underneath warmer, lighter rock that would be the middle part of the mantle. And in fact, you do see that. They've done seismic studies, which are reproduced here in color 3 dimension, that shows cold slabs of rock, the blue stuff, underneath hot rock, which is the red stuff. So once again, the actual experimental observations that we see are consistent with what you would expect from the global flood with Dr. Baumgartner's catastrophic plate tectonics. Now, to get you oriented, there's England and there's Alaska. Yes, and so we see old rock underneath the hot rock. Ah, man. Both there and there. And that's consistent with the flood. Now, in that case, if you go back to look at this picture, what's happening is we start from Pangaea, and we have these things spread apart, but now it's happening, instead over millions of years, it's just happening in a few weeks. And then we have a few more weeks. And then we have a few more weeks to get to this position, and that's about 4,500 years ago until we get to where we are today. Right? So, when you put these two together, right, you have the flood causing all that erosion, depositing all the rock, but before it becomes really hard, you have this catastrophic plate tectonics going on that's generating all of this energy that's pushing the mountains up while they're still pliable and doing all of that folding that we saw without the recrystallization. What about the floodgates of heaven? Well, consider for a moment all the volcanoes that we have, assuming they were originated as when the continents were drifting apart very quickly. We got lots of volcanoes all over the world, particularly down around here. There are many, many of them in Indonesia. And if we look at what happens when volcanoes erupt, you get all kinds of stuff out of it, and it turns out that water vapor is typically the most abundant gas. About 70% of the eruption out of a volcano is water vapor. The other major component is ash, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. So here we have the contribution, another contribution to the floodgates of the, or not the floodgates of the deep, but the windows of heaven, right? So there's water being spewed up from 1,500 volcanoes, that there are 1,500 volcanoes currently identified around the world that aren't erupting. But if they were all going off during the flood, they're spewing all kinds of water into the atmosphere that would condense and fall as rain. Where did the water go? Well, I talked about those big trenches before. And they're really huge, right? They're everywhere where the continental plate comes together with a suboceanic plate, like along Puerto Rico. This is one of the smaller ones. It's 28,000 feet long, very deep. And then there's one all the way down the side of South America. There's one, where the heck is that? I can't, oh yeah, this is over in the Pacific, which is where the largest trench is. Everybody's probably heard of the Marianas Trench, which is the deepest and longest trench that there is. So all of the water went back into these trenches that were caused by, or a result of, the runaway subduction resulting from the catastrophic plate tectonics. And we did the calculation before that there's enough water in there to make a layer 2.7 kilometers deep on the Earth. So we go back to our questions. Was it real? Well, the evidence certainly indicates that it was. And was it really global? Again, the evidence seems to indicate that it was pretty global. Is there enough water? Yes. Where did it come from? We talked about that. Where did it go? We talked about that. So now let's talk about how all the animals fit in the ark. How they got there and how they get off the ark to go around the world. Now, usually we draw the ark like this. And it would be really hard to get all the animals in an ark that looked like that. But of course, the ark didn't look like that. It looked like that, more or less. Now, I think the movie Noah had a kind of slightly different ark. But this is to scale, with all the dimensions that are in the specs for the ark that are in the Bible. And you can see, relative to the people on the little landing, how big it is. So, would the animals fit in the ark? Well, how much space is available? Turns out, if you work out the volume, there's the equivalent of 522 boxcars, railway cars, in the ark. And one boxcar will carry 240 sheep. So if you do the math, you get out your cell phone and do the math, that means the ark would hold 125,000 sheep. Why did I pick sheep? That'll become apparent in a moment. All right, what went on the ark? Well, remember, God was going to destroy all flesh in which was the breath of life, except for the things that Noah took on the ark. 2 of every kind, not 2 of every species, but 2 of every kind or sort, and birds, and animals, and creeping things. Okay, so you'll notice there are no insects. They're just birds and animals and creeping things. And animals, the word that's translated animals here, the Jewish word is bahama, which is variously translated as beast, cattle, or wild beasts. So we're talking about those kinds of animals, right? Now, from an evolutionary perspective, they've grouped life like this in a kind of taxonomical way. And there are 3 major divisions: bacteria, and then that other name that I can't pronounce, and eukaryota. And way over here, we have plants, and here we have animals. And that's where we are, right? We're in the animals, right between slime molds and funguses. So how do you feel about that? Now, in animals, there are 1.4 million species, more or less. But remember, it's not species that went on the ark, it's kinds or sorts. So what's a kind? Well, let's go and look at the taxonomical ranking for all of these biological things. We start out with all of life. It's divided into those 3 domains. And if you look at the one that's highlighted in yellow there, which is where the things are that have to go on the ark, then there are 6 kingdoms, according to the information I got. Animals, plants, funguses, bacteria, those other things. But the only thing that goes on the ark are animals, right? And if you look at the phyla of animals, there are 35 of those. However, if you look at them in detail, they're mostly all marine critters, right? They don't go on the ark. The only thing that goes on the ark are the things with the breath of life in their nostrils. Like when God breathed into Adam, he breathed into him the breath of life. So it's stuff that breathes through the nostrils. The only thing that qualifies in this list of things is stuff called chordata, things with backbones. And if you look at them, then, the classes in chordata are these things. And again, if you look at all of those, they're mostly marine critters. Marine filter feeders, marine animals, animals with backbones, jawless vertebrates, lampreys and hagfish. Those are marine things, fish, more things. It's only when we get down to tetrapods, vertebrates and tetrapods, that we get into the things that need to go on the ark. And in fact, then, if you look at go back and look what was on there, we got reptiles, birds, and mammals. Creepy crawly things, birds and mammals. So, we're looking at those things. And then if you look at the classes of reptile, or if you look at the class reptile, there are 2 orders, 3 families, and about 10,000 species. I couldn't find how many genera there were. And then if you look at birds, you get similar kind of numbers. And if you look at mammals, you only get about 5,700 species, and so on. So then you get around to, well, what's a kind? It's not clear what a kind is, but for example, most people, including evolutionists, now are of the opinion that all of the canine things that we have in the world today originated from one pair of wolf-like creatures. So maybe canines are a kind, and maybe felines are a kind, cats, and maybe equines are a kind, horses. So rather than like a lot of horses and a lot of dogs and a lot of cats on the ark, there were only 2 of each. We don't know. Oh, gosh, these things are like that. These little bit of additional stuff. So a fellow by the name of John Woodmarapp did a very detailed analysis of this kind of taxonomical information and came to the conclusion, it's documented in this book, if you still find it, it came to the conclusion that there would only have been about 16,000 animals on the ark. That, in fact, is probably an overestimate because he was basing it on genera, and a kind is probably higher, and as you go higher in the tree, you get fewer and fewer things. So we may well have had less than that. The other thing to note is that they were likely juveniles. Okay, after all, Noah didn't go and round up the animals. He didn't have to decide which animals to take. God brought all the animals to the ark. So he would bring the ones that he wanted to go on the ark, and bringing juveniles makes sense because they're not so big, they don't take up so much space, they don't weigh as much, so they're not going to make the boat sink so far. They don't eat so much. And equally important for Noah and his family, they don't produce much manure, right? And he looked at the growth habit of all of these animals, and he determined that the median size was about the size of a rat. Now, when I give this talk in Alberta, they all look at me and say, "A what?" And he determined that only about 11% of them would be larger than a sheep. And remember, so if you do the calculation, that's just less than 2,000 of them. But the ark can hold 125,000 animals the size of a sheep. So lots of space on the ark for the animals that needed to go on the ark. I mean, a lot of people get hung up on this, well, we had to put all the species on the ark, but that's not the case. He also looked at the animal husbandry techniques that are currently in use today, that are used in many places in Europe, and he reckoned that using these same techniques, it would have been no problem for Noah and his family, even though there weren't very many people, to actually care for all of these animals in terms of feeding them and looking after the removal of the manure. Now, if we go back to this picture, you'll notice that there's some animals missing. Right? Right? For some reason, we never show pictures of dinosaurs on the ark. But dinosaurs are air-breathing land animals, so they would be on the ark. How many dinosaurs would be on the ark, and would they fit? Well, you sometimes see this kind of diagram, which on the left, it supposedly shows how all the various types of dinosaurs derive from a common dinosaur way back on the left, Mr. and Mrs. Original Dinosaur. But in actual fact, there are no fossil record. There are no fossils of any of those ancestors. The only fossils are the lines on the extreme right, shown on the other diagram on the right, where the scale along the bottom is relative depth, which is actually what you know. That's what you can see and measure. It's how deep in the ground did you find, what layer of rock did you find these dinosaur bones in. The age is an interpretation. Right? So if this actually represents the dinosaur family tree, if you like, maybe there were only 9 kinds of dinosaurs, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Mr. Woodmarapp thinks there might have been 50. So we need to get 100 dinosaurs on the ark. Would there be enough space for these dinosaurs? Well, dinosaurs don't start out life big, right? They hatch from eggs. And one of the largest dinosaur eggs found so far is about the same size as an ostrich egg. So when that dinosaur started life, it was about the same size as an ostrich when it starts life. And scientists, from looking at the skeletons of dinosaurs, have identified that they had a growth habit not unlike people, right? They hatched out of eggs, then they stayed small for a while, then they became teenagers, ate humongous amounts of food, grew to be adults, and then they stayed that size for a while. And as I said, God brought the animals to the ark, so it makes sense for him to bring juveniles. They're small, don't take up much space. A year later, they're still small, and they have their whole reproductive life ahead of them, so they can go out and repopulate the earth. So there's lots of space. That 16,000 animals actually included the 100 dinosaurs, and they themselves weren't very big. They were probably part of the 11% that were bigger than sheep, but not very much. Now, if you think about it, what this means is that after the flood, what happened? The flood went away, the ark came to rest, they opened the door, and everything that was on the ark got off the ark. So that would mean that people and dinosaurs coexisted on the earth after the flood. And there's actually evidence for that. This is a Buddhist temple in Cambodia called Angkor Wat, and it's full of carvings. And this one looks exactly like what? Pardon? A Stegosaurus. What's the matter with the rest of you? She knew. My goodness. Yes, a Stegosaurus. So what's the big deal? Well, this temple was finished before 1200 AD, and the first Stegosaurus fossil wasn't discovered until almost 700 years later. So how did the guy who carved the Stegosaurus know what a Stegosaurus looked like if we hadn't figured out what a Stegosaurus looked like yet? The only rational explanation is that somebody in his culture had actually seen a Stegosaurus, and that information had been passed down sufficiently reliable that the guy could actually carve a Stegosaurus. And there are lots of examples of this kind of thing around the world. There's a bishop in England who has brachiosaurs in a brass engraving on his tomb. Again, that was the great brass engraving was made 500 or 600 years before brachiosaur fossils were discovered. More recently, there's been soft tissue discovered in dinosaur bones. Started with a T-Rex bone. This lady, Mary Schweitzer, discovered this soft tissue initially by cutting a T-Rex bone apart. I don't know why she did that, but when she did, she looked at it and she said, it was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone. This is what it looked like. She put it under her microscope. And she let all the other people in her lab have a look at it. And finally, everybody kept getting more and more excited, and finally somebody blurted out, "You've got red blood cells." But she said, of course I couldn't believe it. I said to the lab technician, the bones, after all, are 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long? Well, in fact, they can't. Blood cells can barely survive a few years. When you die, your rate of decomposition is something that the coroner uses to figure out how long you've been dead. Well, a few years later, she found some more. She found some stuff that was flexible and resilient, and when stretched, it returns to its original shape. She isolated it, it looked like that, and she looked inside, and she found more red blood cells. Now, needless to say, this upset the evolutionary community a bunch. When she was trying to get this stuff published, she had in Science, she had one reviewer say that he didn't care what the data said. Remember, data don't say anything, they need to be interpreted, but he said, he knew that what I was finding wasn't possible. So I wrote back and said, well, what data would convince you? And he said, none. Now, how scientific is that? Right? It so contradicted his paradigm, he was not prepared to accept real evidence. And understandably, because what she said was, when you think about it, the laws of chemistry and biology and everything else that we know say it should be gone. It should be degraded completely. Okay? So that's pretty clear evidence that these bones aren't 65 million years old. Now, Canadians had to get into the act, of course, so this guy over at the University of Regina found some hadrosaur skin. And he says it's real skin. It's not, kind of fossilized skin, it's real skin. And he has the same problem. Now, there's all kinds of stuff now been discovered. Proteins and even DNA. And the DNA presents a particular challenge, because if you look at DNA under normal conditions, depending on the temperature at which it's existing, it would completely disintegrate. Something the size of the human DNA, 3 billion pairs, would completely disintegrate at room temperature in about 2,500 years. Okay? If you can keep it at freezing all the time, it would last 125,000 years. Now, they've looked at DNA in buried bones of the extinct moa bird, and looked at bones from different ages back. And based on what they found, they've done some modeling and determined that even in buried bones, if it's kept at the absolute best condition of -5 degrees all the time, -5 degrees Celsius all the time, it still, in 6.8 million years, would be completely disintegrated. Has a half-life, what they call, of 521 years. And what the people who discovered this wrote was that under that condition, it would only last that long, which he says displays the extreme improbability of being able to amplify, that is detect, a 174 base pair DNA fragment from an 80 to 85 million year old Cretaceous bone. Now, Cretaceous is the name of the rock layer, and the 80 to 85 million is the interpretation of how old that layer is based on uniformitarian geology. Now, so apparently they discovered a fragment of DNA that was at least 174 base pair long from dinosaurs. Now, how big is the dinosaur DNA? I have no idea, because we don't have a complete dinosaur DNA. But suppose it was the same size as the human DNA. Now, if you plug it into the equation that says how fast it degrades, it looks like this. And if you use that 521 years, it means that after 12,500 years, it would be down to 174 base pair, at most, if it was really well preserved. But if the half-life that they got was somehow in error, and they don't have very many samples, so there could be some range of that, it would turn out to be only 4,800 years, which is approximately the time since the flood. Okay, so we got all the animals on the ark. How did all the animals get to the ark? Well, remember Pangaea? Before the flood, all the continents were together. So how'd they get there? They walked. Not too hard, right? So then, how did they get from the ark to everywhere else? Because we no longer have Pangaea. After the flood, we got all of the continents more or less in their current position. Well, let's go back to all these volcanoes. Another interesting thing about volcanoes is they spew out a lot of ash. Now, it's been, remember that one that went off in Iceland and they had to close down all the flights over in Europe and that because of the ash? Okay, so it has a pretty significant global effect. In fact, there were some volcanoes that went off down here that caused the climate, the winter in Russia, the other side of the world, to be below average temperatures for the subsequent 4 years. So even a single volcano can have dramatic climatic effect on the other side of the world even. So if you figure we got all these 1,500 volcanoes going off, blasting ash up into the atmosphere, what that ash does is reflect the sunlight. And what that does is make the atmosphere cooler. So during the flood, we have all of these fountains of the Great Deep and all of this tectonic activity with the hot lava warming the oceans, causing a lot of evaporation. We have all of the volcanoes spewing up the ash, causing the atmosphere to be cooled. So all that condensation, all that evaporation condenses as snow and falls on the continents in particular. I mean, it'll fall on the oceans as well, but falls on the continents in particular, which are being protected from the sunlight. And you know what happens when a cloud gets in front of the sun, right? All of a sudden it feels quite a bit cooler than it was when the sun was shining on you. So the continents now are cooler, so the snow doesn't melt, and it keeps building up. Now, as the evaporation occurs, that cools the ocean. Over time, the snow builds up on the continents, and we have the Ice Age immediately after the flood. Eventually, the ash falls out of the air, the oceans cools down, they stop evaporating so much, the sun gets through, warms up the continents, the ice melts, and we're back to where we are. But during the Ice Age, this is the sort of scope projection of the aerial extent of the ice during the Ice Age, and it's been calculated that all of the water that was in all of that ice would have reduced the sea level by about 120 feet. So if you look at Google Earth, you go and get on Google Earth and you run around, running the cursor around looking for places in the ocean that are less than 120 feet, you find out there would be land bridges everywhere except right down here. There is a little piece between Indonesia and Australia, about 300 kilometers wide, where the land wouldn't quite be exposed. Now, evolutionists claim that the Galapagos Islands were populated by things that came on weed mats or vegetation mats 1,200 kilometers from South America. So getting across 300 kilometers sounds like a breeze if you can do 1,200 kilometers. If you look in detail at Indonesia, it looks like this. You've got all of those places down there are all land except that little bit right there. Okay, so I already did that. Oh, yes. So if we start out, if the ark lands here, then clearly the animals and people can spread all around the world. They can get across the Siberian Sea up there with the land bridge up there, and they can then go all the way down North America, and it's a piece of cake. They just walk. So we got all the animals all around the ark. And how did the animals get to the ark? Get from the ark to Australia, and indeed everywhere else. Now, how about Noah and his family being able to breathe when they're way up above the high mountains? And could they possibly repopulate the earth? Well, here's the kind of situation we have today, where we have the earth that I've drawn in blue, and we have a mountain, and then we have the atmosphere. So when you go up the mountain, you're going up, the atmosphere is getting continually thinner, so it's harder to breathe. But when we had the flood, it would be like this, right? So the flood, the waters now are covering everything, and that's where the atmosphere starts. So they're actually at the bottom of the atmosphere, not the top of the atmosphere. So it would be just like today. They would have the same atmosphere to breathe that we have today. How about repopulating the earth? Well, population growth curve looks like this. It's actually got an expression like that, where this little number here is the rate at which the population increases. And if you look up in Wikipedia, the world population in 1999 was supposedly 5.3 billion, and in 2010 it was supposedly 6.9 billion approximately. If you put those into that equation, the number A is 0.0131, so 1% population growth. So if you go back then and look at 2,500 years ago, when the flood happened, and there were 6 people, I discounted Noah and his wife, they'd already had their kids, so I'm assuming that only their children would produce a kid. To get to 1990, you only need a population growth rate of 0.4%. So it would be quite easy for 6 people over that length of time to produce that number of people that we had in 1990. Okay, so yeah, they could breathe okay and they could repopulate the earth. How did the freshwater fish survive? Well, there are lots of aquatic species that survive in both freshwater. I mean, you got a lot of them out here, right? You go catch salmon. Salmon go spawn in the freshwater and they live in the ocean, so they're perfectly able to survive in both places. They grow up there, or they get born there, and they live in the freshwater for a while, and then they go out in the ocean, and then they go back. And there are lots of salt marshes around the ocean edges where different kinds of plants survive in salt. Well, you know, the tide comes in and makes it salty, and then it goes out, and they're in freshwater. How about these flood stories? Well, yes, there are flood stories all around the world. All different cultures have flood stories. And the interesting thing about it is they all contain many of the same components of the biblical account. And if you chart that against distance from the place where, the place where it originated, the Assyro-Babylonian place, when they're very close to the origin of the real flood account, the correspondence between the flood account in the other culture and the one in the Bible is very close. As you get further and further away, as the people spread around the world and got further and further away from their origin after the Babel business, then they started to lose elements of the flood story. And so you can see when you get around to Hawaii, which is now on almost the other side of the world, a lot of the stuff has been lost, but a lot of the stuff has been retained, all of the kind of really important ingredients by destruction by water and humans saved and all of that kind of stuff. So, again, freshwater plants and things could thrive, and the biblical flood story, or the flood stories, appear to be derivatives of the biblical flood story that had all of the essential information in it, and then as it distributed around the world, it got lost. So all of the evidence that we see is consistent with the history that's recorded in the Bible. Now, I started out, I think, with these two things, that as Christians, we're always to be prepared to be able to answer people's questions about our faith, and or to actually be a little bit more active and counter arguments that are put forward. And in order to do this, we need to have information, right? I mean, you can't answer somebody's question if you don't have the information to answer the question. And I've tried to convey some of that information tonight with respect to the flood. I mean, there's tons of other stuff on all other topics like biology and whatnot. But even this stuff on the flood, well, you may have also, oh yeah, well, that's interesting. You know, what happens when you walk out of here? You start forgetting it very quickly. In fact, this guy Ebbinghaus did some experiments to measure how fast people forget stuff, and it's really fast. If I'd been part of the crowd, it would have been measured in hours rather than days, I think. But the other thing we know from our time at school is if we want to pass the exam, we should review. Because every time we review, we remember more for longer. But in order to review, you have to have the material available to review. And that's where this comes in. This is one of the other mechanisms that Creation Ministries provides for getting information into your hands. Remember, we had the website and the email newsletter. This is a magazine that comes out 4 times a year that is chock-a-block full of information about this in nice, short, easy-to-read articles. Some of them are only a couple of paragraphs long. I got a couple of issues over there so you can have a look at it to see what it's like. But it's probably the best tool that we have for equipping people, because once you subscribe to it, it just appears in your mailbox, right? Every 3 months, you get a new one. You don't have to do anything. It's just there. And you can read it whenever you want. Some of the articles are so short you can read them during the advertisements on TV. Or you can put it beside your bed and read it before you go to sleep. Or whenever, it's really good. So, it used to be kind of difficult to subscribe to Creation Magazine because you had to decide whether you wanted it for 1 year or 3 year, whether you wanted the print edition or the digital printer or both or whatever. It's got too confusing, so it's been changed. So it now runs like Netflix. Does everybody know about Netflix? Right? Subscribe to Netflix for, $7.99 a month. You can watch the movies. Well, this is now kind of like Netflix, only it's $7.50 every 3 months. So it's much, much less than Netflix, but it works the same way. Every 3 months, we'll debit your credit card or your bank account of $7.50. But you get the hard copy. You don't have to decide whether you want the hard copy or the digital. You get the hard copy and the digital. So you can download the digital version on up to 5 different devices. So if you've got iPhones or iPads or that kind of stuff, or your laptop or whatever, everybody can have their own copy. You don't have to wait for mom and dad to get finished reading it before the kids can read it. They can have their own digital copy. And if you take out a subscription tonight, we have a couple of DVDs over there that you can choose from for a free gift. So now I'm going to ask the volunteers to pass the clipboards around again. This time you should see this form. And the idea is to fill out your name and address and all of the information necessary for us to get the magazine into your mailbox. Tear that off, bring it over to the table over there, and make sure you have all. We'll make sure you have all of the information that's required, and then you pick up your free gift. And then on top of that, there's all kinds of other stuff over there. I mentioned this book before. If you're interested in that business about the catastrophic plate tectonics, there's a DVD over there put together by Dr. Baumgartner that goes through it all and shows you the results of his computer simulation. There's this other DVD. I don't think they actually sent any of these, but it's available through the website, of how the flood reshaped the surface and how the animals got around the world after the flood. This is an excellent, comprehensive geological discussion of the flood. It's a 2-volume thing written by Dr. Andrew Snelling, who is a geologist. And then there are books and books and books. Where is this book? This book is an excellent book to have. It's the answers to the 60 most frequently asked questions that CMI speakers have. So it has some on the flood. It has some on carbon dating and radiometric dating and all sorts of other stuff as well. And then, of course, there are all the articles on the website. And if you didn't sign up for InfoBytes, we can still do that. And that's the end. So now the plan is, oh, no, it's not quite the end. This is very interesting because Jesus said, just as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the days of the Son of Man. They were eating and drinking and marrying and being given in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. So Jesus obviously understood the flood to be a real worldwide global event. So it seems to me, as his followers, we should do likewise. Now we're done. Now I think the plan is to have a little break, and then we'll come back for some questions and answers.